It wasn't that long ago, just 1 year ago, where President Biden was talking about how the United States would be escalating the war in Ukraine, talking about escalation in terms of missiles, long-range strikes, sabotage attacks deep within the Russian backfield, the Kursk incursion going across the line into Russia proper, pushing the Ukrainians to do that back in 2023, that summer, 2 years ago, the incredibly failed summer counteroffensive where Ukrainian troops were smashed against Russians in places like Mariupol and Melitopol. This was the issue that President Trump came into when he came into office. President Trump didn't start this war. President Trump was a private citizen when all of this was taking place. We're now looking, there's numerous White House officials, they're coming by as we go. And folks, President Trump has always been against war. He's always pointed out that it never should have happened. And in fact, President Putin said this to him when he was meeting at that meeting in Anchorage, that it wouldn't have happened had he been in office, because they would have found a way to have that one-on-one deal, that one-on-one conversation between President Trump, President Putin, and then, of course, President Trump also being able to go and have that sit down with Zelensky. And in fact, he's always been sitting down with Zelensky, all the way to the fact that even one of his phone calls with President Zelensky became the basis for an impeachment back in 2019. It's very clear here, folks, that Ukraine represents, to a number of the Atlanticist interests, the globalist interests, something far more than just the people on the ground or even the leaders in Kiev. It represents what they have been working on for over a decade, a project, Project Ukraine. And that project, unfortunately, has been to pit them against the Russian Federation and to escalate this to the point where they could foment a war. Now, the globalists, the Atlanticists, will tell you that if they are able to achieve this, that it will force regime change in Russia and it will force President Putin out of office. However, that's not happened at all. In fact, far from it. We're seeing the Russian army, the Russian military, is now on the advance. They are the ones who are currently on the march. They're encircling Ukrainian troops in the Donbass as we speak. They're creating these operational cauldrons, and they're cutting off the supply lines. As we said, and Human Defense said, you can go back, Lieutenant Colonel Tony Schaefer, when we've had him on, other analysts we've had on, all of these things have been taking place, keyed up on when? The end of July, beginning of August. We told you that this would be the time that it all came to a forefront. Why? Because what we're now starting to see is a rolling collapse of the Ukrainian military on the battlefield. And that rolling collapse means that the Russians are now poised to break out, not just beyond Donbass, but even all the way up to where? The Dnieper River. And the Dnieper River really bifurcates Ukraine north-south, going from all the way in the north, from Kiev, all the way down south to the Black Sea. And that's what this has all been about, that Black Sea. Now, there are people, by the way, in Russia that do not want this deal. They're saying, why sit down with the Americans at all? There are hardliners to the right of Putin who say, we want the entire thing, or at least the entire coastline. Take all the way up to Odessa and leave behind a failed rump state of Ukraine. That's what the Russian right is saying. On the Ukrainian side, they're saying no deal. Don't negotiate with a country that invaded us. Don't negotiate with a country that's come in and started this killing, that started this shooting, that started this aggression. They are the aggressor. Why would we negotiate with them? So it's President Trump who's now coming in here and he's divvying this up. Now, I've heard from a lot of people saying, look, we don't want to see American boots on the ground in Ukraine. Everyone I've talked to in the administration, that is the furthest thing from any of what they're saying. Now, these questions, though, I know I saw this going around yesterday, Article 5 like security guarantee. What does that mean? Well, on the Russian side, in fact, the Russians have always agreed that Ukraine should have a security guarantee. The question is, who are the guarantors? Are the guarantors of that going to be NATO? Are they going to be European nations, or perhaps a consortium, a coalition, if you will? That's what you're hearing from the Ukrainians as well the Europeans and the G7 members that are here, that are meeting here today, the NATO leaders. They're saying, why not a coalition of the willing? Russia, on the other hand, has said we'd be willing to join such a coalition and perhaps even involve the Chinese Communist party. So all of these factors are playing into the meeting that President Trump, the series of meetings that he embarked in last Friday in Anchorage, now today in the Oval Office in the White House. I want to get in now. We've got a couple of minutes till the break. I want to get in now some of the Real America's Voice team. I think we have Bo and Emily down there in West Palm. Guys, you there?
Yes, we are, Jack. It's great to see you on the North Lawn there. Jack, if I could, I'd love to touch base with you here on a topic you just touched on before you have to jet. With respect to Donbass, my understanding is that there's economic value to it, but there's a defensible reason that Ukraine wants to keep this because the terrain is different. And if you open up that territory to the Russians, then it's basically flat farmland all the way to Kharkiv and Kyiv. Is that why a place like Donbass is so critical in these negotiations?
Well, I mean, pretty much all of Ukraine is really that low flat land, that low flat farmland coming off from the Black Sea. The Donbass, yes, it has an extent of terrain to it, but it's really not that much. And yes, to your point, the key geographic formation that would include any kind of military barrier after the Donbass really is just that Dnieper River. So there aren't really any, and again, it's just these remember, Ukraine is the breadbasket of Europe, and it certainly was the breadbasket of Europe prior to the war. That black soil that they have in Ukraine is incredibly arable land because of its proximity to the Black Sea. That's why the growth there is so incredible, and it's also why companies like Monsanto and other GMOs have been looking to get into Ukraine from the very beginning. So there's, to your point, not just a military reason, but also an economic reason.
And Jack, what would be the best possible scenario coming out of today in that meeting right behind you?
Well, you know, the best possible scenario would be a peace deal today, and I certainly think that each side is going to have some consternation. Each side will have to make concessions. The Russians have been willing to say that they don't need to get all of the provinces that they're claiming. They're sort of positioning that as a concession, whereas the Ukrainians are saying we want just up to the contact line and nothing else, so up to the current front line. But really, it's about getting a peace deal as quickly as possible for President Trump, for the administration. I think that's what they're driving towards, and one that, again, isn't just going to be a ceasefire that could fall apart. They want an actual lasting peace deal that could perhaps set a new framework for relations between the United States and Russia and the entire West.